So my name is Will Bible. I'm the Deputy Leader of Audit Transformation for our Audit Assurance business. And to give you a little bit of background, we have been on a digital transformation journey since around 2015. We went through a process of rapidly innovating and deploying digital technologies to solve specific pain points in the audit process and try to replace manual steps, really with a focus on standardizing our workflows and digitizing. All of those things were in the pursuit of improving overall audit quality. And since that time, we've now progressed to where we have a globally deployed, fully digital platform, which we call Omnia. As you heard in the prior discussion, data is a key enabler for deploying AI. So that platform, Omnia, is a really critical element that might come up again in today's discussion. I'm joined by Brian Crowley, who leads our data science group that works in the Omnia portfolio. And he's going to be talking about how we're using AI to transform our actual audit services, including some of the work that we are doing with large language models and have been doing for several years. And I'm also joined by Ryan Hittner, who is leading the development of our AI and algorithmic assurance services. And so he's going to share insight about what he sees going on with our clients in particular. So with that as a background, I'm going to ask Brian first. Obviously, we're here on a 24-hour event, so everyone's hearing a lot about AI in the news today. How is this impacting the audit business? How are you thinking about it leading a data science group, and how are we embracing the technology in this profession?
Yeah, thanks, Will. There's our business, like really all others, is being impacted in a variety of different ways. Really, as our clients digitize their operations, the data that's available to us as auditors is just growing exponentially. And quite frankly, it can be a challenge to handle all that data through human means alone. Will, you mentioned a lot of what we have done previously in the past related to our transformation journey. Really, that journey is predicated on this fact, that this data explosion was happening. And as a result, we've been standardizing our processes, digitizing and structuring our data, and developing and deploying advanced analytical capabilities, including AI, in response to it.
So I know we've today the Q&A and everything else is going to be dominated by large language models, but what's kind of the full set of AI capabilities that we focus on within audit? If we could maybe round out a couple of the things that we work on. Sure.
Yeah, I think there's probably a little bit of a misnomer kind of at play with our profession with the term auditing and public accounting. Sort of the first sort of thing that comes to people's minds when they think about the audit business is that traditional finance and accounting sort of role that's heavily steeped in quantitative analysis. And we're certainly addressing the numerical aspect of the data that we deal with, by developing and piloting anomaly detection capabilities that use unsupervised learning to point out outliers among millions of transactions to highlight potential areas of increased risk, whether that's due to misstatement, due to error or fraud. But really, while that numerical quantitative analysis is an important aspect of our responsibilities and our kind of day-to-day workload as auditors, really the more common form of data that we deal with is written word, written language. We have descriptions of transactions, account names, fact patterns that are written in memos, various forms of transactional evidence, accounting guidance. That's just a sample of what we read and analyze every day. And we also do a lot of writing to create the documentation that's required to explain and evidence the work that we perform as a part of our audits and the considerations that we make. And of course, all that writing is again subject to multiple rounds of more reading through various levels of review in our audits. So major opportunities to accelerate those processes through natural language processing capabilities, both traditional and some of the new capabilities. For example, within the Omnia platform, we have document AI in the form of our Argus module that can extract information from contracts, from invoices, and other similar types of unstructured written data en masse, which can really greatly accelerate our testing procedures. And we also have a capability referred to as Omnia suggestions that analyzes long-form internal control documentation and provides our auditors with a summary of some of those key control characteristics within those control activities. So really a lot of uses that we have in development and that have been deployed.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point about all the written word. I know I've reviewed a few work papers in my time, and the detail that's in there can be quite a bit. So Ryan, when you're looking and working with clients, are you seeing the same kind of thing? How do you see them deploying AI into the finance and reporting field?
Yeah, so I guess maybe just real quickly before we go into financial reporting specifically, I think as most of us know, wide adoption of AI across industries. So tech, recommendation systems, finance, fraud prevention and detection, advertising, ad placement, optimization of audiences. So, AI is being used in a lot of key places. One of the things that we tend to see is that adoption has been generally high for low risk areas. And so what we mean by that is the risks of AI producing an erroneous output or something that an organization wouldn't agree with. The risks of that happening would have low impact. So low impact to the organization. So if something is wrong, not a big impact, not millions of dollars at stake. So that's where we're seeing AI getting deployed first. But that's changing quickly. We're seeing more and more of AI being deployed into other parts of the organization. So with financial reporting, we definitely are seeing limited use cases so far that organizations are deploying, limited for sure. But we do see that changing. So we've spoken with number of vendors out there. We know many vendors that are building AI systems specifically targeted at the CFO organization. Things like internal control for financial reporting, other types of AI looking at transaction monitoring, anomaly detection for journal entries, expenses, accounts payable. So lots of use cases that we're seeing being deployed, not being developed and being designed by vendors. In one case, we're talking with in a couple of cases, we're talking about generative AI for financial statements. We'll talk about this later on, but in that type of a use case, we think it's very important to have a chain of review. But I think the way organizations are thinking about it is that there's an ability to take some of the low level or maybe some initial draft versions of write-ups about certain components of the statement and being able to use that as draft one, and then being able to incorporate that into a typical review cycle of a statement. But yeah, definitely evolving. We definitely expect to see much more AI being deployed into finance over the next 2 to 3 years. We think that's definitely likely.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. The questions are kind of lighting up from the audience about how risk is managed when we start to put these solutions into some of the critical processes. You mentioned that maybe the lower risk solutions first, but ultimately the value being generated here will lead organizations to use it in more critical processes. How are companies thinking about mitigating risks? What do they do, to try and mitigate the risk of inaccuracy or incomplete?
Yeah, and maybe I could just talk a little bit about the risks first, that the types of risks we're seeing. So I think it's important to denote that there are differences between where the risks lie, right? There are many stakeholders. There could be organizational risks. There could be downstream risks to the customers or clients of that organization. So obviously big things that we're thinking about is disparate impact for certain protected groups among the population. But ultimately for the organization, we're kind of seeing categories like reputational risk, even the concept of the knowledge of AI being used, just simply the public knowledge of it, could that impact reputation? And we've obviously seen cases where that is the case, just given the difference of opinion of AI currently in today's climate. We think that's definitely something that could impact the organization. So that's something we have to look at. Operational and financial, right? So if AI is being used in a place where it's making decisions without control or human involvement, certainly open to risk there. And then the big one, which is something that's evolving, we talked about it in the last session, laws and regulation. So definitely something that we're seeing at least bipartisan agreement. I know that very few topics are bipartisan agreement these days, but certainly AI regulation is something that everyone seems to agree on, and protecting the downstream users, people that are going to be affected by the outcomes. They mentioned it in the last session, but the New York City bias law, one of the first actual laws in the U.S. That's going to be focusing on AI and actually going live in July. So something that we're seeing that one. We're seeing various other bills and proposed laws going through various stages of legislation, but definitely, yeah, the risks are there for sure. And maybe, and I could talk about the mitigation if you like, Will, as well.
Yeah. Now that you've enumerated all the risks people have to be worried about.
Yeah, right. So I think, listen, we have, Deloitte has a trustworthy AI framework. There are lots of, we mentioned a few before, that the National Institute of Science and Technology has a framework and guidelines. We have the White House AI Bill of Rights guidelines. So lots of similar concepts when we talk about how do you mitigate risk. I think, from my perspective, I think two things are very important. One is having a general mission statement and value statement for AI. I think many organizations just go at AI without understanding what the goal is. Is it trying to scale up? Is it trying to do more of a certain task? Is it trying to improve the outcomes for users? So I think that's something that is pretty important, that should affect both the design, development, and the use of AI across an organization. And that would affect, and that would definitely affect the ethical uses as well. So that's something that I think that organizations should follow, that type of mindset. Two is just all the governance frameworks that we see out there. And I think some of the important things are whether, a policy that would have all the permissible use cases that the organization would feel comfortable using AI for, controls, standards across, development, use, testing and monitoring. In other industries, we see things like validation. We alluded to previously, the validation in, for example, the financial industry, which is looking at all types of models, quantitative models, and performing validation tests. And validation can mean lots of different testing procedures. And one of those is conceptual soundness and logical underpinnings of the model, and making sure it has logical intuition behind it. That becomes difficult with AI. I think we all see some of the number of features that are included with these models. So coming in and then trying to understand the intuition behind the model becomes a little difficult. So we are seeing more of the focus being spent on performance monitoring. So rather than, do we agree with the conceptual soundness of a model? It's more about how is it performing, and making sure that if we have certain performance metrics that we want to hit and make sure we want to track, make sure that that's something that we keep an eye on. And if that falls below a certain indicator or limit, then we have to look at, is this still working in the way that we intended day one at conception? So at inception. So I think there are definitely ways to mitigate risk, but there's a lot that we're learning about. Even regulators right now are really trying to think about how do we instill laws that will mitigate these risks. And ultimately it's a hard task, but it's something that at least some of these higher level frameworks we think are step one of getting to that mitigation ability.
Yeah, Ryan, I like that idea of having a very intentional framework for how it's deployed. A lot of what we hear people concerned about is somehow the mathematical model getting loose in the world and taking things over, but it has to be put in that position, right, in order for it to actually have any kind of influence. So Brian, I'm going to turn back to you. When you're thinking about the generative AI, which is the hot topic, how do you see that being deployed in audit, and what's our view of where that should be kind of put in a position to accelerate or be used as an enabling tool within an audit process?
Well, generative AI is certainly exciting. I think everyone can kind of agree on that. What it can ultimately do for really anyone, but certainly our business, is turn everyone into a software engineer. It sort of acts as a translator between human and machine. Does so much more than just generate content. There's a lot of the human machine interaction that it can facilitate. And with the proper tooling, it can significantly enhance productivity of our people. It's sort of like having 1,000 very well-rounded interns that all you really need to do is just tell the model, tell these interns what you need it to do and how it needs to do it, and you get an incredible, meaningful output from these generative AI capabilities. some of the ways that's impacting our business and the way we're approaching it is opening up things like the opportunities with enterprise knowledge becoming decentralized and democratized, because this capability makes it so much easier to access and to search. It really makes everyone in the business as knowledgeable as the most knowledgeable person in the business, because they have access to all of that on the edge. Also extracting information from documents. We mentioned the Argus module and the document AI capability that we already have today. That can become even faster and able to handle even more complex information extractions, like a variety of different table formats or infographics that we're starting to see a lot of in ESG reports, for example. So doing a lot more complex things that we're able to do. And quite frankly, we're just scratching the surface. I think the whole the industry, society, business at large is really just scratching the surface of what these capabilities can do. But there's already a lot that we've seen that it can do. So a lot that we think it can do for our business.
So Brian, you have a team of people that are really focused on this, and I know you get a lot of interest within our organization from individuals who maybe have a passing interest or have read the news or have seen something and now want to understand more about it. What advice would you give people to trying to kind of upskill themselves when it comes to this particular topic?
Yeah, the good news is that a lot of this generative AI is incredibly user friendly. My advice would be that people go out and learn really as much as they can about prompting, which is this concept of interacting with the model itself, these generative AI models, how a human can provide instructions to these models, as well as prompt engineering. So taking that to the next step, which is how to do that really effectively. There's a lot of nuance in effective prompting. The business world, technology world at large is constantly discovering new nuances of how to communicate with these different AI models and these different generative AI capabilities. Things like giving the model a persona, explicitly telling it not to lie, giving it the opportunity to critique its own responses and then create another response, taking into account those criticisms, those self-criticisms. There's really a lot to learn, but prompt engineering is really a great place to start.
Ryan, what's your view on how people trying to upskill themselves should think about these new technologies?
I actually was in a workshop yesterday exploring use cases, and I was impressed with some of them in the ability to summarize and extract data. Something that I think every day I'm learning a new use case or something that works well. I also found that with some of the models now trained on almost everything, that it's able to, I think we have other text to code models that are out there specifically trained for text to code, but we're seeing now that some of these advanced large language models are able to just do that because that kind of sits on the internet's training data anyway. So some very interesting use cases. I think we all have to be creative, and we all have to be ready to see how that could be introduced into our workflows. I'm always a little bit skeptical of the risks, and I think it's important to have, I'm always going to say that, have some level of review. I like the fact that it can take out that first mile of writing efforts or some sort of design effort where you can get that draft one and then take it to a place where you want it. And I think that, that saves time, that's effective. And it's not whether we can use this and then publish it after it gets produced. I think it's more about where does it fit in the workflow and how we could effectively bring that in and use it and not be worried about the fact that it's an uncertain device, right? The output is always going to be uncertain. I think back to my point about whether you can validate these things or test them or assess them. I don't think we really have an intuition of how a certain prompt will map to an output. So I think we always have to be ready for a poor output, even as these models progress into the future. So having that awareness, kind of finding a place for it to fit in the work, in your life, in your workflow. I think that's kind of how I'm thinking about it as I go forward.
Yeah, thanks. And so, Brian, what are some of your experience in actually, deploying these things? What are some of the limitations that you've discovered in this process? If you can talk a little bit about, it's always nice to see the neat parlor trick to start with, but when you start to dig down into it, what have you discovered, and what lessons have you learned?
Yeah, I think there's whether it's with generative AI or traditional AI, and I think this was discussed in the previous AI lifecycle session as well. Really, data is king, and we found that we've tried to do things with, I don't want to say invalid, but not the best data. We're trying to use synthesized data to solve for a problem that really requires real data. That's really kind of lesson learned throughout, number one, throughout this entire process, whether that's with the traditional capabilities or the new capabilities. Really, without that accessible, discoverable, organized data, it becomes really difficult to develop, to test, to pilot, and quite frankly, to convince business stakeholders of the value of AI, because you can't show anyone the real thing. You don't really have a means of determining and displaying how effective an AI capability really is. So as I mentioned earlier, the generative AI capabilities are just becoming much more readily available and really user friendly. So that hard development work, that traditional computer science, data science work, is already sort of done for an enterprise and for us as well. And you just really need to hook it up to your own data effectively. And there's a variety of different ways to do that. Step one is just getting the data and approvals for the data, securing it, ensuring that you're not certainly running roughshod of professional responsibilities or contractual responsibilities with data. As well as then developing the capabilities to connect to it effectively, because that's getting it is one aspect that you need to certainly cover. It's another aspect entirely to hook up some of these capabilities to that data set to effectively interrogate it. The other thing that I would the lesson learned that I think anybody in attending this webcast can sort of attest to if they've tried to do something like this in an enterprise context, is that you really have to get everybody on board with what you're trying to do with AI. Meaning, it takes a corporate village, so to speak, where you don't just need data science and computer science and some of the IT components, but you really need to have risk on board. You need to have all your legal functions on board. We talked about the different regulations that could potentially be impacting us. You have to have these quality, these QRM processes to ensure that what you're building is in fact enhancing the quality of what our practitioners are doing and the actual product that goes out the door, as well as operations. Traditional auditors. Everybody really needs to be working together from the beginning in parallel, not in sequence. Because in this day and age, as we're all sort of experiencing this tempest that we're a part of, things are moving incredibly quickly. So you can't be mired in this long-tailed process. All the ducks have to be in a row working together.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Ryan, what about lessons learned that you've observed?
So I think what we've seen is that the infrastructure can get quite complex. So we are seeing that, I think, again, I spent a lot of my career in a certain industry where the models were maybe a step down, a lower amount of complexity in terms of what goes into the model. In those cases, I think there's some easier ways to implement them and deploy them. AI becomes difficult from the training perspective, the inference perspective, change management across a pipeline. And a lot of people are using many applications across a pipeline to get to a final product. It becomes more complex. It's more costly. So I'd say a lot of people that I've spoken to are looking to fill or looking to place AI into a certain use case. I think the other way around is a little bit better. What are the problems we have? A lot of problems can be addressed by traditional technology. I think there's certainly a place for structured technology with algorithms that follow rules that we know the output every time. I think there's a really great place for AI in many use cases, but I do think we have to think about that for how we deploy. I think we've seen a number of we've had a number of conversations where we've been part of working sessions, and the question is, where do we put either generative AI or traditional AI, if you will? And I think that's something that will get folks into trouble, because I think it's more about what is the biggest impact or where are the problems now, and then what type of a solution can we use for that problem? In many cases, algorithmic or a rule-based approach work really well. In fact, we've seen some organizations taking algorithmic decisions, so rules, building AI on top of that, which kind of effectively gets you back, if you have a really good AI model, gets you back to the algorithm or the rules that you've developed originally. So, I think we have to really think about what's the use case, especially for use cases where we don't know the output, or sorry, we don't know the ground truth, and we don't understand whether something is potentially fraudulent or not. So we've seen a lot of approaches that aim to have a probability on whether a transaction is fraudulent or not without truly knowing. At the end of the day, I think a game plan is to look at a metric where you let some of that, either whether it's clicks, whether it's transactions or signups, right? In terms of identity theft, let them in the door, see where you have tagged correctly with that model, and kind of track that over time for maybe a small amount, so you can kind of keep an eye on how well this tool is doing at picking up on the positive, right? The positive outcomes that you're looking for. Just some of the things that we have a lot of conversations about this, and I think these are some of the things that keep bubbling up. I think there's a lot of excitement around AI right now, including myself, but I am also a traditionalist too. I think there's a lot of great places for traditional tech to come in and be neighbors with AI, but maybe not be AI may not need to be the center focus of that show.
Yeah, Ryan, there's a lot of questions in the chat around, I'm going to kind of term it as safety. And how do you safely use it? And even a question around the performance metrics that you mentioned in the Trustworthy framework. What are some examples of performance metrics that you could use to evaluate, or other evaluative techniques that you could use to look at models while they're being executed?
Yeah, so it goes back down to the mission statement of that model, or that system, what it's being trained for. So there are a lot of cases where we it's a forecasting device, right? Where we're anticipating the outcome to happen. It's great to go back and back test that and see if it did. In fraudulent, so in identity theft, for example, right? So people are signing up to a website. You want to make sure that their identity is accurate. What's the chance that they are going to commit fraud after they sign up and get an application on a website? The question comes is, if we turn them away, right, immediately from the output of the AI model, we won't really ever know if that person was going to be turning out to be a legitimate user or was going to commit fraud. So I think that point I was trying to make before is having a period of time where you take a investment in allowing the door to be open, right? So you let everyone in. You definitely use the AI model to tag certain individuals or certain profiles that you think are fraud likely, and see what happens, and track that over time, and see, are we getting better at that? Or are we getting worse? I think there's many metrics to look at, but these are the ones that are trying to get to the predictability of the model. And then certainly, relevant for the New York City bias law in terms of the automated decisioning tools that folks are using for either screening resumes, any type of hiring decisions, or even promotion decisions. Disparate impact, making sure that we're not disproportionately harming certain protected groups. That's certainly a metric that organizations are being required to follow in New York. So definitely those metrics are important too.
Yeah, you hit on a key word there, which is automation. So a lot of what I seem to get from people concerned about AI safety, it's less about, if you really peel it back, the AI, and more about the automation. So you could put an automated rule in place that makes a critical decision in a process that has nothing to do with AI, but it's just flat out wrong. And that's equally as unsafe. So I think some of the questions that should be asked around deploying AI models is really around automation. There's a question here about, should there be a doomsday switch? And I think only if you put the automation in charge of the doomsday device. I mean, that's kind of, there's choices to be made in the use case and choices to be made in the way in which systems are deployed. And that really governs, the kind of safety mechanisms that you need to have in place. An AI model that Brian, you deploy to write an accounting memo is, not going to take over the world on its own. But if you did put it in charge of a nuclear fleet, then geez, that was a decision to make. And so I think that those are, important considerations when we talk about technology in general. There's one question in here I'm going to try to answer, and I'll get your thoughts on this too, guys, about, jobs. And I don't think anyone here is going to predict what's going to happen with employment. I would say that most of us are looking at this and even struggling to see a couple of years out in terms of how this technology impacts society and the workforce. I guess the one thing, though, I always reflect on is technology step change rarely results in economic regression, right? It usually results in an economic expansion of some sort. And so while the nature of jobs change, you end up with probably more jobs than you had before, even though they might be in different categories. So I guess I'd value your final wrap-up opinions on where you think all this is headed and any kind of final thoughts. And we'll start, Brian, with you.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think it's just, we talk a lot about how analogous some of these AI capabilities are to the advent of computers when they first came to our industry, and calculators, and how they never really fully replaced jobs. They really just expanded the role of the human and expanded the capability of the human, and that's sort of what we're anticipating. It's just we can't quite see where that full extent of that change is taking place, especially with generative AI. But you also can envision a future, certainly in our profession, where the amount of depth that we can provide with our audit opinions becomes deeper. It doesn't necessarily. We're not going to keep the same static level of reasonable assurance per se. I can foresee that changing over time, just as it has. The opinion, the reasonable assurance of an opinion 15 years ago is probably different from what it is today. We don't know the answer to that, but you can argue that it could be different today based on all the different analytics and data that are available to us today. So I see a continuation of that, where we're going to be able to provide our clients and the capital markets with incredible depth and incredible amounts of quality in our audits that we weren't able to do previously with the same amount of workforce. That's where I see it going.
Yeah, and I guess I would focus, at least in my response, not to comment on the jobs aspect, but it's more about what skills or whether there's jobs available for certain roles that are going to change. But it's more about what are the skills that are needed for a successful role in the future. I think even in my career, as I hire, the skills that I'm looking for have changed over the past 16, 17 years. So without a doubt, I think AI or being able to use AI effectively or being a little bit, have an understanding of potentially how it works, to know the pitfalls, to know the use cases and the ways that it can be effective. I think that becomes really powerful. And I think if you have that ability to do it, I don't think it's going to be changing, the job market in great leaps. But I do think every technology does change what is needed out of the workforce. And I think daily it's changing. So we should just be ready for that and understand what are the tools of the job today and what are the tools going to be for tomorrow, and how do we take those bets and try to put ourselves in good positions for the next few years. So it seems that game has never changed, right? That's always been a game of the job market. So definitely think that's something that we'll all have to think about and be ready for.